Good afternoon. My name is Cameron Wagner from the SWE Professional Programs team, and I am here to welcome you to today's webinar, A Critical Update, Changes to Title IX Implementation and the Impact on Women and Engineering. Our speakers today are Della Cronin from Bose Washington Partners and Anne Hedgepeth from the American Association of University Women. A couple notes before we start the live webinar. There's a handout available with resources that we'll be mentioning today, and you can download that by clicking the handout drop-down menu in your GoToWebinar panel. You can also type in your questions using the questions drop-down, and they'll be answered during the Q&A portion at the end of this session. The recording from this session will also be available in the Advanced Learning Center within 72 hours and will also be sent out to all attendees. If you're watching the on-demand version, that resource will be available under the Resources tab in your on-demand player. A couple notes about SWE before we get started. For more than 6 decades, SWE has given women engineers a really unique place and a voice in the engineering industry, and that means we're centered around a passion for our members' success, which means stimulating all of you to achieve your full potentials as engineers, leaders, and people. Our professional development focuses on a variety of learning methods and is designed to suit all learning styles. You can access that learning content in the Advanced Learning Center, which can be found on SWE.org, going to the Learning tab and clicking Advanced Learning Center. So a little bit about today's speakers. Anne Hedgepeth is from, like I mentioned, the American Association of University Women. As AAUW's top policy advisor, Anne drives the organization's advocacy work. She connects with stakeholders and policymakers on AAUW's policy priorities and directs AAUW's field strategy. She supported AAUW's successful work to pass the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, and the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act, including the Campus Save Act. Anne has appeared in the Washington Post, Politico, NPR, NBC4, WTOP, Refinery 29, and other outlets, talking about issues impacting women and girls in education in the workplace. She has a Bachelor of Arts in Economics from Davidson College and a Master of Public Policy from George Mason University. So welcome, Anne. And Della Cronin is our other speaker. Della is a principal of Bose Public Affairs Group, which is a comprehensive government affairs and strategic communications consulting firm based in Washington, D.C. Cronin brings over 25 years of experience in education and research policy, legislative and regulatory processes, fundraising, and public affairs to the firm, having worked for a broad array of education, research, and STEM education companies and interests. In recent years, Cronin has been involved in efforts to elevate the profile of STEM and computer science education in K-12 schools and federal and state policies, as well as equity in education and workforce opportunities. Cronin holds a bachelor's degree in economics and a minor in political science from Virginia Tech. And so, without further ado, I'm going to say the learning outcomes and then hand it over to Della. By the end of today's session, you should be able to describe SWE's advocacy efforts, how SWE advocates around Title IX, and our position on the recent Title IX changes that you all might be aware of. You should be able to discuss in depth the recently proposed changes to Title IX and how AAUW is responding to these changes. You should be able to explain how Title IX and the recently proposed changes impact women in university settings and women in engineering. And you should be able to identify where to go when you have a Title IX complaint to file. And so, Della, I'm going to hand it over to you and put myself on mute here.
Great. Thanks so much, Cameron. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and talk to you a little bit about what is going on at the Society for Women Engineers in terms of their advocacy efforts in Washington, D.C. Just to set the stage for our conversation on Title IX, I'd like to remind the audience today what SWE's overall advocacy agenda is. It's an organization that has a lot of different members with a lot of different perspectives on a lot of different issues, and so the organization really strives to keep the advocacy efforts to those issues that all members care about. SWE public policy initiatives support the organization's mission by engaging the members in policy issues that impacted the advancement of women in engineering. And the goals really are to provide SWE members with timely information and tools to enhance their understanding of the issues and encourage volunteer participation at the federal level on the issues that they care about. We also aim to educate other professional societies about SWE's interests and the issues that they weigh in on, as well as policymakers on how to apply Title IX to STEM fields, which can sometimes be a complicated area of policy. In terms of the broader advocacy agenda, I think it's worth reminding folks on the phone who are clearly interested in what SWE is up to in Washington, D.C. about the other issues that it works in. It is given the organization's concerns about the STEM pipeline and how it affects women in the engineering workforce as well as the STEM workforce generally. One thing that we really care about is strengthening our country's schools. At the federal level, what that means is ensuring that there are investments in programs that support educational opportunity for all students, although SWE does take a particular interest in those programs that emphasize female participation in STEM fields as well as socioeconomically challenged populations and other populations that have traditionally been underrepresented in engineering and other STEM fields. We also work with other folks in the STEM education community to ensure that STEM education is supported by federal lawmakers and the suite of federal agencies in a manner that reflects the national priority placed on growing the STEM workforce. We hear consistently from lawmakers that they're very interested in figuring out how to get talent into the STEM workforce, and we're always talking to them about how to best do that in K-12, career and technical education, 4-year programs, 2-year programs, and all the different other kinds of programs that support a healthy and diverse STEM workforce. The second thing that we talk to folks about in Washington, D.C. is Title IX and how it affects all manner of federal programs. Our goal is to ensure that Title IX is applied to STEM fields and women in the women in STEM fairly and effectively. This includes making sure that female students are safe at K-12 schools and on college and university campuses, and it's that aspect of the law that we're going to talk about in more detail today. Making sure that female faculty and administrators are in safe and supportive workplaces on those campuses, because there are not only female students going there, but there are also obviously female employees that we are concerned about on campuses across the country. And then making sure that Title IX is being applied appropriately at federal agencies and that female researchers are being treated fairly. We've seen this work in working with folks on Capitol Hill in making sure that federal research agencies are awarding federal grant dollars to female researchers in the appropriate ratio that we'd like to see. The other thing that we are trying to do for aspiring and practicing engineers is strengthening the STEM workforce by ensuring equal opportunity for women in STEM education careers. This means supporting workplace policies that support success for female STEM professionals, making sure that they're supported in the workplace, and then asking for the appropriate enforcement of existing laws related to discrimination on the basis of sex and employment, pay, and education. And that can mean a lot of different things, but it certainly, that 3B element also encompasses Title IX. And then again, in emphasizing the importance of there being federal laws that support women in the workplace and their desire to be successful. We also support workplace and employment policies that nurture the needs of female engineers and STEM professionals. That's the ability to come in and out of the workforce and make sure that employers are not penalizing women for the time that they might take off for other personal needs. And then encouraging employers to provide comprehensive health and wellness programs that foster professional success for female engineers and professionals. So how do we do this? Of course, like every organization that works in Washington, D.C., there's some mix of consistent efforts that we take on year in and year out, and then of course being opportunistic when opportunities present themselves. I think it's pretty obvious that the 116th Congress has a lot of women. There are the November elections put the percentages of women on Capitol Hill at 26%, which is the highest it's ever been, which is still not anywhere near where we'd like to see it. But the excitement around this infusion of females on Capitol Hill is an opportunity for SWE and AAUW and other organizations that look forward to working with those women over the next 2 years. In terms of things that we do regularly in Washington, D.C., we obviously talk to and meet with lawmakers to discuss the issues that were brought up earlier in the presentation. We're also members of coalitions that have a sort of amplified voice on these issues, including the STEM Education Coalition, the National Council of Women and Girls in Education, which we are partners with AAUW on, and then many other allied organizations in Washington, D.C., the National Society of Black Engineers, Hispanic Engineers, programs that help young girls get interested in STEM education, programs that help them get through college, many different kinds of organizations in Washington, D.C. that have voices on these issues that are important to SWE. We consistently write to lawmakers about these issues and sign on to letters with other allied organizations. We host briefings on the Hill and webinars like this one. And then in March of every year, we do a Capitol Hill Day where we invite members of the Society of Women Engineers to come to Washington, D.C., and we arrange for meetings with them with their members of Congress and host sort of a 2-day agenda that includes some coaching on how to do meetings and what we hope they talk to members of Congress about in those meetings. That event is coming up at the end of March this year. Hannah George, who is an organizer of that event at the headquarters in Chicago, I asked her what the opportunities were for folks to continue to come to that event, since we've been talking about it for about a month and a half now with members. There's still some slots, so if you're interested, get in touch with Hannah at headquarters to come to Washington, D.C. in late March. So that's an overview of SWE and their advocacy efforts. Obviously, this webinar focuses a little bit on Title IX and what's going on. I suspect if you're on this webinar, you know that the Department of Education has recently proposed some significant changes to Title IX and its enforcement on campuses across the country. SWE is obviously concerned about those changes. We've weighed in with the Department of Education, and we'll talk a little bit more about specifically how we've done that towards the end of this webinar. But we wanted to invite Anne to talk to this group today because AAUW has really been a leader on this issue, marshaling political will across the like-minded communities in Washington, D.C., and Anne is well respected in DC on these issues. And so we're really looking forward to hearing from her about more about Title IX and what the rule means for women in higher education.
Thank you, Della, and thanks so much to SWE for having me today. I'm really excited about this conversation, and while I'm going to provide some background about AAUW and our advocacy, about Title IX generally and what it does, and about the recent proposed changes, I know we're going to create some time at the end for questions. So I hope that if I move too quickly on something or don't cover something in depth, people will ask questions so that we can make sure you all get the information that you're looking for. Just to quickly share with folks a little bit about AAUW and how we fit into a broad coalition of groups that are working on these issues in Washington, D.C. and across the country. As many of you know, we are a national organization. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization with over 170,000 members and supporters across the country. And we advocate on a whole host of issues that impact women and girls in schools, in the workplace, with regards to civil rights and leadership opportunities. And we've been around for a long time. A frankly pretty badass group of women got together 135 years ago, and they were going to college when women weren't going to college, and figured that there was strength in numbers and banded together and started creating some paths forward and support for other women who were thinking about going to college. And that became AAUW. We give out money every year, continuing a tradition that they started in the form of fellowships that support women in higher ed. They did a fair amount of research, which we continue to do to this day, about women in STEM, about women in leadership, about Title IX, about student debt. And we do a lot of advocacy because it became quickly apparent to our founders that some laws and policies were going to have to change if classroom doors and then ultimately workplace doors and other elements of society were to become more equitable. One of the huge successes, I think, of all of that work was seeing Title IX pass and become law over 45 years ago. And as a result, students today have protections that I think AAUW's founders only dreamed of, that all schools at all levels are free from sex discrimination. But the reality of seeing Title IX fully implemented is that it's complicated and it's definitely taken time. And so I did want to provide some background information or some framing about what Title IX does more broadly, because when we get into talking about some of the new proposed changes, we're going to zero in on some specific elements of Title IX, but I don't want us to forget about sort of the big picture of the promise that it affords students. Title IX prohibits sex discrimination in education. And what that looks like is that schools are expected to adopt policies that prohibit sex discrimination. They're supposed to implement grievance procedures for students and faculty and staff that provide for a prompt resolution and an equitable resolution whenever there's an incident and someone comes forward. Schools are also expected to publicly appoint a person to coordinate this work, often known as a Title IX coordinator. Over Title IX's life, we've definitely seen different issues come to the forefront as being sort of a focus or a thing that Title IX's attention is directed towards. Many of you all will know that initially Title IX was and continues to be an important tool for women who are facing discrimination and seeking tenure or their employment in higher education. Title IX also leveled the playing field for women and girls to pursue athletic opportunities. And while there's still a pretty big gap in those opportunities every year, we've certainly seen that gap narrow substantially since Title IX became law. Today, we're going to talk a little bit more about sexual harassment and sexual violence, but I included a list here of all of the areas that Title IX impacts. And you can see that they're myriad and they really truly are about the entirety of the education experience that students have. The goal here is to make sure that students have access to education and that it's free from discrimination, that they can enroll in any programs, be it a STEM program or career and technical education, that even if they are a pregnant or parenting student, they retain access to education, and that education is free from sexual harassment and sexual violence, which is a form of sex discrimination. Because recent changes have focused on sexual harassment and sexual violence, I wanted to provide some background, moving on to this slide, about sort of how those issues are a part of this conversation and what we know about what students in particular are experiencing with regard to sexual harassment and sexual violence. AAUW research has shown that about 2/3 of college students experience sexual harassment, and nearly half of students in grades 7 through 12 do. Research shows that about 1 in 5 women and as many men and gender nonconforming students are sexually victimized in college. And ultimately, and AAUW's research really speaks to this, sexual harassment and sexual violence are impacting the ability of students to access their education. They are a form of sex discrimination, and they do disproportionately, although not only, impact women and girls in schools. And our real goal is to make sure that schools end sex discrimination, including sexual harassment and violence, and have in place the right protections and responses when it does occur. We also know, though, that schools really aren't meeting that charge today. And one of the ways we see that is that in research that looks at whether or not students are coming forward to schools and reporting incidents, and whether or not schools then disclose those incidents publicly, we're seeing a real failure. In AAUW's analysis of annual data that's reported to the federal government, 89% of college campuses disclosed 0 reported instances of rape in 2016, which really is a departure from the research of the prevalence of these types of incidents. Some schools really are not fully addressing the issue, and what that tells us is that going into any conversation about policy changes, we are really concerned about anything that would reduce reporting of sexual harassment or sexual violence, or reduce the school response to sexual harassment or violence. Those changes would be the opposite of what the research tells us that students need and what schools need to be doing. Before we talk about changes to the rule, I did want to share, though, that Title IX is a critically important law, and students have protections and outlets for if they experience any form of sex discrimination. One way that you can take action if you experience sex discrimination in any of those areas that I described earlier is to go to a Title IX coordinator at your school. They're supposed to take steps to stop the discrimination and to prevent it from recurring. And that can look like putting in place interim measures or providing accommodations to students or even taking disciplinary actions. AUW has a Title IX coordinator locator tool on our website, which we've linked to here and is in the resources provided with this program. And I hope that you'll use it. Schools do sometimes have changes in their coordinator throughout the year, and they should be making that very publicly available to anyone who's a part of the community as well. And I hope that's the case at the schools you are associated with or know about. If you feel like your school has not done what it's supposed to do, the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights is supposed to be a backstop, and you can file a complaint with OCR to take action and prompt your school to do what they're supposed to do. There are resources available online on how to take those steps and file a complaint with the Department of Education, and you can explore there to learn more. I will flag that there definitely have been some changes to the approach of dealing with complaints at the Office for Civil Rights under the current administration. And that shouldn't discourage people from filing complaints, but it does mean that it may be different than the experience someone had 3 or 4 years ago in filing a complaint. The current Department of Education is not doing as many systemic reviews across schools' functions, so they may be able to address your individual incident or problem that you're having. They may not dig deeply into whether or not that's a repeated issue across the school or something that's happened historically. We know that some complaints are being dismissed by the department without a lot of explanation, and that can be really frustrating and is certainly something that we're continuing to look into. And there are obviously, I think, a lot of marginalized students and faculty and staff who have found the Department of Education to be more hostile to their complaints or concerns. And that's definitely, I think, a problem with the process right now. But there are also ways to move forward with a complaint with OCR if it's something you'd like to do, and the information is available there. With regards to incidents of sexual harassment or violence, I also wanted to make sure people knew a universal way that you can seek some confidential services or resources using the National Sexual Assault Hotline, which is available to anyone. Also, obviously, you are welcome to file police reports if the incident is appropriate to do so, but you are not required to, and your rights under Title IX are not affected in any way, whether or not you do so. AUW has some resources available about your rights on campus on our website, and I hope you will check those out. So moving on to what the proposed changes coming from the Department of Education are, I think I probably have to start by doing a quick mention of what a notice of proposed rulemaking is, or an NPRM, or the wonky process by which we are engaged in right now with the Department of Education. Title IX already has an existing set of regulations, and what we've learned over time is that it's sometimes important for the Department of Education to provide an update or additional information or clarifying details about exactly what schools should do and what students, faculty, and staff's rights are. In the past few decades, those updates or clarifying pieces of information have taken the form of guidance documents, which provide information to schools and students about exactly how the department interprets Title IX and its regulations. We've seen that different departments, other administrations have issued regulations around Title IX, which sort of comprise Title IX's existing regulations. And I think many of you who've been engaged in this work know that over the past 12 years, there was really a heightened attention to how schools respond or don't respond to sexual harassment and sexual violence. And under the prior administration, the Obama administration, there was guidance issued to help schools do more to respond to sexual harassment and sexual violence. There was also a question and answers document, and there was additional technical assistance that was happening from the department to schools. This is happening at all levels of education, though today I may talk mostly about the impact on higher education, but that's certainly an aspect of Title IX that's critical to note. This administration has decided to issue new regulations on Title IX, or update the current ones and write some new ones, and do that through a notice of proposed rulemaking to start, which is what happened this fall. They put out a proposal with a lot of changes and explanations and welcomed comments from organizations and individuals, from interested parties and stakeholders. And they will take all of those comments, consider them, and then eventually decide whether and if to finalize a new regulation for Title IX. We've just ended the comment period, so we're now sort of in limbo, waiting for the department to read all the comments. But we can look at what was in the proposed rule and how a lot of us weighed in to understand a little bit of the direction of where the department's thinking about going. Again, this is from a proposed rule, so there's always a possibility that what's finalized won't look like that. But I want everyone to have the information about what the Department of Education has been thinking about. There were a handful of changes proposed. The first one I wanted to mention is that the Department of Education is proposing to narrow the definition of sexual harassment under Title IX. It would require that students or faculty or staff experience sexual harassment or violence that's so severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive that it denies them access to education. And for a student, what that might look like is that they would have to experience repeated harassment, escalating harassment, many incidents before a school would intervene. And the reality is they may also have to see some interruption in their education in order to demand the support, accommodation, and response from their schools that I think we would all expect. This is really troubling because Title IX does not require that students experience discrimination in pursuit of ending that discrimination. It actually demands that schools end the discrimination. And so we're really concerned about the new definition of sexual harassment that's been proposed. I think we can imagine, too, the impact of this new definition on students at all levels of education and also on faculty and staff, where repeated incidents of sexual harassment or violence could be something a school would then not respond to until it becomes extremely severe. And I think that's really discouraging and problematic for students in our schools. The next thing the proposed rule would do is reduce which employees were required to respond to reports of sexual harassment. So students would have to navigate a confusing set of rules to know who to come forward to if they've experienced sexual harassment or sexual violence. They might tell someone they trust and expect action and get none, and they would not have any recourse or expectation that their school was supposed to do something. We know that this can be a real problem in terms of working to increase the reporting around sexual harassment and sexual violence. Going back to an earlier slide where I mentioned we've noticed there is a real gap in what students are experiencing and our reported numbers, this would have a real impact or chilling effect on whether we're getting an accurate set of reporting around sexual harassment and sexual violence, and would also mean that schools are not taking action on a whole host of reports just because they're coming in to the wrong teacher, professor, advisor, or member of the faculty. Another change that's really problematic is that schools would be required to ignore any sexual harassment or sexual violence that occurs outside of a school activity. This would be a lot of activities, this would be a lot of incidents that occur off campus, much harassment that's experienced online, and it detaches the notion of the sexual harassment and violence impacting a student's education from these requirements under Title IX, and instead makes it about where the harassment or violence occurred. That's a real disconnect from what Title IX has always intended, which is to make sure that students don't experience sex discrimination that impacts their access to education. It's another place, too, where I think it's really easy to imagine what this would look like for students. Just because you're harassed or experience sexual violence on your way to and from school, at an extracurricular activity, at the hands of a professor or advisor at an off-campus location or in a restaurant or somewhere local, but not technically as a part of the school activity, that harassment would now be something that the school doesn't have to act on. And I think that's deeply concerning for stopping the sexual harassment and discrimination and for making sure that students are able to stay in school. Another change that we're concerned about is that there would be some, the way schools would respond would shift to make it harder for students to come forward and receive the supports that they need when they experience sexual harassment or assault. So if you're someone who's experienced sexual harassment or violence and it's severe enough, it happened in school, you found the right person to report to, and you want something done about it, you would still have a couple hurdles to get over. First, there would be some changes in the way complaints are formally submitted. Students who experience sexual harassment and violence would bear the brunt of dealing with any accommodations or interim measures like changes to class schedules or dorm rooms or access to labs or other facilities, instead of sharing that burden across both parties involved. And schools would be able to use mediation or compel students to use mediation during their resolution process, which leads to the final change that we're most concerned about is changes that would make the process that students, faculty, and staff go through when they come forward with a complaint, an incident, and decide to move through a grievance procedure. That process would become more adversarial and unfair under the department's proposed rule. We would see that schools would be able to provide unequal appeal rights and use an unfair standard. And we also would see institutions of higher education be required to put in place direct cross-examination during grievance proceedings. For these and a whole host of other reasons, AUW weighed in opposing the department's proposed rule, and we urge that it be withdrawn. There are definitely aspects of Title IX's implementation that need additional clarity, but this proposed rule is going not in the direction that we had hoped that it possibly could. And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, in a direction that's about encouraging students to come forward, making sure that reports of sexual harassment and violence are addressed, and ensuring that schools are taking the action that they're required to take.
Thanks so much, Anne. And I just want to reiterate that SWE definitely feels that AAUW is such a great resource for the community that cares about these issues and a partner. I wanted to share with folks on the webinar some of the things that SWE has done this year on Title IX. There have been a number of bills that have been introduced by legislators on Capitol Hill that address sexual harassment on campus. In particular, is one from Mrs. Johnson, who's the chairwoman of the Science Committee. That's a reaction to a report from the National Academies last year on sexual harassment in the scientific workplace that SWE has signed on to. There have been other bills that are familiar to folks who follow these issues that have been introduced that SWE has endorsed repeatedly as well. So that is a legislative relief that SWE is supporting on Capitol Hill. In addition, as Anne has gone through very comprehensively, there's action at the Department of Education on revising regulatory guidance for schools and how they deal with some of these issues. And SWE has submitted comments of its own to the Department of Education on the proposed changes that takes issue with some of the proposed changes that they have around the barrier for reporting for victims on campus and how that adversely affects them and their access to remedy, as well as the decreased burden on institutions in terms of dealing with victims and their complaints with an eye toward more generous treatment of the victims versus what we would consider to be some protections for the institutions. We've also signed on to other folks' comments that have been filed, including the AAUW comments. But here on this slide, you can see the SWE comments on the proposed rule that were submitted earlier this year.
Yeah, and I'll just add that AUW's comments are available online too if you'd like to read them. And while I covered some of the bigger buckets of issues that we have concerns about, there were a few things I didn't even get a chance to get to. So you should feel free to read them online. You'll see them there. And the coalition comments that many organizations were able to join that similarly reflected a lot of these concerns with the proposed rule. Earlier in the presentation, I know I mentioned some things about knowing your rights on campus, and we do have a resource available on that and an ability to find your Title IX coordinator. And so I think this sort of spans the sort of immediate, which is how Title IX works right now, what your rights are and how it works on campus, to what could be the future of Title IX and some tough changes that could be coming down the pipe. We do know that if and when the Department of Education finalizes a Title IX regulation, there'll be one more chance to comment on it, and that'll be something that folks will hopefully be able to engage with us if they're interested in doing. And until then, we'll be monitoring for any other changes or guidances or other information coming out of the department.
All right, thank you, Della and Anne. So we're going to take questions now for a few minutes. So we've gotten a few questions just to start from people who are asking about the slides. The slides for this presentation will be available in the Advanced Learning Center. So that's advancedlearning.swe.org. The link is on this slide here. And if you were interested in any of those resources that were outlined in the slides before, go ahead and click on that handouts drop-down menu in your GoToWebinar panel. You should be able to download a resource from there where all the links that were mentioned will be available for everyone. So I just want to put that out there again for people who are asking about the slides. And so we had a few questions from the audience. While you guys were speaking, there was a question from someone just asking, is it known why some of these changes are being proposed? It's just hard, I think, for some people to understand why certain things would be pulled out of Title IX. I'm not sure if that's a question that anyone's able to answer.
Yeah, this is Anne, and I'm happy to provide a couple of context points, but it is complicated, and you'll see in some of the comments that were submitted, especially in AUWs, we do try to push back on some of the arguments the department makes for making these changes. Some of those are in the weeds and complex and about Supreme Court decisions or interpretations of the law, and I probably won't be able to cover all of those here today, so the comments are a good place to look as well. I think one of the things that happened is that there was a lot of backlash against the efforts that were made under the prior administration to tackle sexual harassment and sexual violence. And some of that backlash, I think, is important and reflected where schools maybe aren't getting it right. And that's something that we need to address to make sure that policies are correct, that grievance procedures that are put in place are fair, that they are equitable, which is Title IX's charge. And if that's missing, then that's a place where additional guidance is really necessary and additional work by the Department of Education is necessary. Unfortunately, and Della sort of alluded to this, some of then the reaction by the Department of Education is to really reduce what schools have to do then. And that feels like the wrong answer to the problem. And so a theme throughout the proposed rule is reducing what schools respond to, reducing how they do it, reducing who does it, really minimizing the response. And I think that that is something that might be a misplaced reaction to the sort of ramped up attention to the issue. So that's one, I think, sort of element of what's going on here, although there certainly are many and a lot of different pressure points.
Great, thank you, Anne. There was a question that was asked before the webinar on the registration page that from someone who said, I have a protection through Title IX. How will the process to get these protections change, and will existing protections be altered?
I'm not sure if I understand the question entirely. So right now, there are no changes yet, but if the proposed rule were to go into place, we would see that schools would need to, moving forward, develop new policies and new procedures. I think our expectation is for right now, though, schools and the Department of Education are adhering to the status quo, to the law as it is right now. And so I think that there will be questions and concerns about people who may be in limbo if they have a complaint or something had happened to them in the coming time before a rule is finalized. But we understand that the law stands as it is right now until it's finalized, and then schools will put in place new rules.
And Anne, this is Della. I mean, given the department's master calendar rules and all that sort of thing, I mean, any would-be changes wouldn't take effect until academic year 2021? No, 2021? What do you think?
You know, it's not clear that the civil rights regulations are subject to the master calendar, but I do think that's a really good point about the amount of time it's just going to take and how OCR will expect schools to implement this. And this is actually, I think, a point of contention that AAUW raised in our comments, but a lot of organizations did, about estimating the burden on schools to put in place brand new policies and procedures and what's realistic for schools to pull that off. And I think you're totally right that we're looking at a time frame where a school couldn't fully put in place a new policy on this until at least 2021. Now, a strategy that folks may know about and may have participated in was to also make sure the department got a lot of comments on the Title IX proposed rule, and they're supposed to read them all. And I think that has the potential to affect their ability to promulgate a final rule, also maybe widening that horizon before it could go into place.
All right, thank you guys. A question from the audience. And there were a few questions about this as well during the registration. Someone wanted to know, will these changes impact the applicability of Title IX to transgender, non-binary, or non-gender conforming folks? And if so, how?
So I'm going to defer to Anne if she can answer it, and maybe it's beyond her purview as well. But if Anne, you were talking, you were on mute.
Oh no, I think I was on mute. I'm so sorry. Thank you for flagging that. I was just saying that, you know, there's some aspects of the proposed rule that don't really tackle issues around the protection students who are LGBTQ have head on. They would obviously, though, be impacted by any shift in how we respond to sexual harassment and violence, since we do know that students, marginalized students, LGBTQ students, a whole host of groups experience sexual harassment and violence at a higher rate. But something I didn't talk very much about is that there's a change to the religious exemption provisions in the proposed rule. And I think that's a place where we'd really see LGBTQ students experience adverse effects. Schools could hide that they're getting a religious exemption from Title IX, and students may think they have protections they don't have, which would be, I think, really devastating. The department is separately attacking, I think, the protections that LGBTQ students have outside of this particular regulation. And that's also something AAUW is working on, because we do believe that Title IX provides protections, ensuring that students can be recognized by their gender identity, that if they experience harassment because of their sexual orientation or gender identity, that they have protections under Title IX. That's our position, and one that we think the department should be implementing.
Great, thank you, Anne. Question from the audience. Someone asked, do these changes help address when a person should report the incident to the police?
You know, the rule does give more leeway, the proposed rule, excuse me, gives more leeway to schools to defer to law enforcement in their investigation and work. And the real effect of that, something we see at colleges all the time, is that it means that schools then delay resolving the things that they can resolve around class schedule changes or accommodations or around the protections that students have to access education. I think there's a real conflation of what the role of police and the role of schools are. So that's one aspect of the proposed rule that does overlap with the involvement of law enforcement. It doesn't change, though, that you don't have to report to law enforcement and to receive protections, but the incentives there would shift some.
All right, thank you. Can schools still choose to require all staff to respond to reported incidents, or will the new rule require schools to limit employees who can respond?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, and it's one that I think is a little complicated. There's a part of the proposed rule that actually would require schools to dismiss some kinds of complaints they get, reports they get, if they aren't things like severe or on campus or reported to the right people. But we do know that schools in other instances will be allowed to still do things for students. And so it's not entirely clear what the landscape would look like, exactly how every school will navigate that moving forward. But it does look like a lot of schools would feel like it was okay to instruct staff and faculty to ignore some complaints.
Okay, thank you. There was a question about the LGBTQ issue. Someone just wanted to know, is SWE being inclusive of the LGBTQ interest that when drafting comments on policy, or are we working with other groups who focus on LGBTQ?
Yeah, so our comments were, the SWE specific comments were a little narrower than AAUW's. We did sign on to actually, I think I misspoke earlier, we signed on to the National Council for Women and Girls in Education comments, not the AAUW ones, although they're both very significant bodies of work and folks should look at both of them. We don't, in SWE's comments, we don't specifically call out the LGBTQ issues or implications. But as I said, we did sign on to the NCWG ones, which do touch on those.
All right, thank you. There was a question about a slide earlier, which I'll go to. Jane wanted to know, in slide 10, can you describe a little bit more about how the issue of safety is described and addressed by Title IX? And Anne, you are on mute if you are speaking right now.
Yeah, sure. I know that this is, a slide that's a little bit about the SWE agenda, and so I want to make sure that if Della has something to add, but obviously, what we've been talking a little bit about today is the way that Title IX ensures that schools are free from sex discrimination, and a form of sex discrimination is sexual harassment and violence. And there are a lot of ways in which we make sure that students don't have to experience that sexual harassment and violence, that they're safe at school and free from that kind of discrimination. And obviously the changes we've been talking about are a little in the weeds around policies and procedures, but they serve the goal of making sure that students are safe and that they're free from discrimination.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we meant on that slide, was that making sure that women and girls are safe as students, as well as employees, as administrators, and as researchers in all the environments that are meant to be protected by Title IX.
And I'd love to add, I feel terrible. I slip into saying students a lot when I talk about some of the issues we've been discussing today, because I want people to understand the real impacts. But one of the most powerful things about Title IX is that it provides protection to anyone who's a part of school. And so faculty and staff, research assistants and graduate assistants, students at all levels of education. And the things I've been talking about today, the proposed changes, I think would all have implications for those different groups in a host of different ways because of the ways that those individuals interact with their schools, with people who might harass them or assault them, and how they might go about reporting or dealing with incidents. So an apology on my front, but hopefully people can see some of those connections on the issues.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anne. Della, someone had a follow-up question just about the LGBTQ issue. Is there a reason that SWE didn't address the LGBTQ implications of these changes?
So I think that SWE is a fairly conservative organization in advocacy, and there is, I would encourage whoever that person is, and feel free to give that person my email address, and we can sort out the advocacy agenda and the points that are included there. I think that if there's members who feel like SWE should be being more aggressive on that front, we're happy to talk about that and consider that request.
Yeah, and you can email learning@swe.org, and we're happy to connect you for any follow-up questions. Someone wanted to know, how much freedom do schools have to define their own policies if they wanted stricter policies?
You know, generally speaking, even given all of these changes and prescriptions I've described, schools have leeway to do a lot of things about how they structure supports and accommodations, how many people they have on campus who can respond to these issues, and even putting in place, not required by Title IX and without the backstop of support from Department of Education, other provisions or policies if they wanted to. One of the challenges, though, is that there are some things in the new proposed rule that schools must do. And so they are a requirement about using certain standards and the definition of sexual harassment, about dismissing claims if they don't occur in school, about exactly who and how grievance procedures are conducted. So it's a mixed bag, and I think that we'll see that were the proposed rule to become final, there'll be some schools that decide to put in place exactly what the proposed rule requires, and then outside of Title IX, do other things. And that can be valuable to students and faculty and staff in the moment, but it's just a reminder that it doesn't come with some of the protections of enforcement of a private right of action, of an ability to go to the Department of Education with a complaint. And so that's why some of this can be concerning about what bar Title IX and its regulations are setting.
All right, thank you, Anne. And one last question. Someone wanted to know what individuals can do, like outside of, SWE or AAUW, to stop these changes going forward, or maybe voice their opinions on these changes.
Such a great question. And I love hearing that interest, because I think there are a lot of things that people can do. The regulatory process is complicated, and now that the comment period is closing, we're waiting to see what the Department of Education can do. But schools do continue to have the ability to do the best case scenario under current law, and people can advocate with schools to make sure they're keeping in place strong protections and policies. We know that public opinion really matters here, and AAUW has been working with our advocates to make sure that they're doing things like writing letters to the editor and op-eds on the issue so that their communities understand what's going on and how it will impact them. And I think that that's a route for anyone who is thinking about these issues. And then obviously there will be more opportunities to weigh in on the proposed rule. I mentioned there might be another comment period. And so if folks feel like they missed this go around, there'll be a chance to engage again when a final rule is proposed. So those are some of the things that we've been encouraging advocates to do. Della, I don't know if you have any other suggestions or things that you've seen folks engage with.
No, I think those are great. And I would encourage folks to go back through the slides and look at the resources that you and I have both shared. And I'm sure that will lead them to other places where they can sign up for updates or Twitter handles to follow to stay informed on the developments as they come. I also would encourage folks, if these are issues that are very important to them, to consider getting in touch with their members of Congress on these issues. If there will eventually be a legislative intervention on Title IX, putting the ball sort of in the legislative branch's court on how to make sure this law is doing its job. And it's legislators' jobs to know how these laws are affecting their constituents for good or for bad. And if there's a story to tell, then you should, I encourage you to consider getting in touch with those folks and telling that story.
Sure. There's a follow-up question about that, actually. Susan wanted to know, how is it possible for us to find out how our representatives feel about these issues?
Sure, this is Anne, and one of the ways is to look back through things like AAUW Action Fund's congressional voting record, where we have scored legislators on some of these particular issues and some of the bills that would advance Title IX's protections and ensure students have more support over the years. That's a place where you can learn more about their support. And over the next few months, we'll see legislation be introduced in this new Congress. I know Della alluded to some of the proposals out there, and I'm certain there'll be more to come. And seeing whether your legislator ends up co-sponsoring those bills or not is really a place to advocate and rabble-rouse. AUW will provide updates on that in some of our newsletters, and I know those will be things, too, that we make available on things like our website.
Great, thank you guys. And sorry, there's actually one question that just came in just about the proposed changes. So considering the proposal would only make Title IX applicable for incidents occurring at school activities, what on-campus non-activity events are still covered? Does this cover things like incidents in campus locker rooms?
Yeah, so it would include and still cover things happening at the school itself. So those would be included. I think the big concern and what we see in sort of everyone's day-to-day life is that there'll be harassment that either starts somewhere outside of technically school grounds or as a part of a school activity, that it escalates somewhere outside of school grounds or not a part of a school activity, that it happens online and is not happening through a school computer. And those would all be the types of incidents where you'd still come to school every day or go to a class every day or be in a dorm room or a lab every day with people, say, who are your harassers or your rapists, and the law would not be providing you the same protection. Your school would not be taking action or be required to take action because the incident happened technically off school property and not in a school activity. There were some questions about exactly what the department meant in the proposed rule, so we may get more clarity about that in a final rule, but taken together, AUW found the entirety of it to be concerning and problematic. And so I think that we do not like this proposal that's been put forward.
All right, well, thank you for the clarification. That's all the questions that have come in for now. Again, if people have follow-up questions that they didn't think of during the webinar, you can always email learning@SWE and we'll connect you to the speakers and try to get you some answers for your questions. I just want to end by saying that the recording will be available in advance and will be sent to everyone who registered for the webinar. So you'll be able to see the slides there. I would, again, encourage you to download that handout and, take a look at all the resources that Della and Anne have provided. I just want to end by saying thanks to everyone for joining us for today's webinar for this really important update. And I want to thank Della and Anne for, being there to provide us with some insights and information on what's going on. And Della and Anne, I don't know if you guys have anything you want to close out with.
No, but thanks for everybody for listening. I think this is a very important issue, important to SWE and its membership. And I would like to echo your thanks to Anne for joining us, because her expertise has been quite helpful today.
Thank you all so much for having me. And I'm so glad, I think we all see the value in making sure that students and faculty and staff feel safe on campus, that they are free from sex discrimination. And unfortunately, engaging on these regulations is something necessary in order to realize that promise of Title IX. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk more about that today.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you guys. And thanks to all the attendees, and have a nice rest of your afternoons, everyone.